You rank 29th in the country in returning production, and yet the guy that everyone wants to talk about and is really the focal point of the spring is Bryce Underwood, who I'm sure we'll talk about in a second. But I did find this interesting. Who do you think is the returning leader in offensive snaps on this Michigan football team heading into this spring? And this is a player that was on the team. Yeah.
Snaps from last season or in his career?
Last season. Offensive.
Would it be Gio El-Hadi?
It is. That is correct. Great one there. Defense. What do you think?
I got to remember who's on this roster. I feel like Ernest Hausman is.
It is 2 for 2. Let's go. So those, Michigan does have 9 players, offense and defense, 4 on offense, 5 on defense, that started at least half the games last year. But when I was going through this and looking at it, a lot of other guys had spot starts. A lot of guys were close to that halfway point of 6, but you don't count those unless they're over 50%. That's how we do it in our magazine. So, keeping it consistent. That's kind of how I think of it, I guess. If you started over half the games, like you were cemented as a starter. But Michigan, with the opt-outs in the bowl game, some injuries that they had throughout the season, and then just position battles never being settled in situations, guys that have started. So there is some experience on this team. I've talked about it in the past, how unique that is to bring back 2 captains from last year's team. You don't often see that. You have Max Bredesen and Rod Moore back. So, but it is interesting, like we said, that the number one thing people want to hear about this spring is Bryce Underwood. And that's the number one thing that I'm excited to see when they take the field April 19th for the spring game, when hopefully you would assume he suits up and gets some experience in front of the fans there at the big house. People would be disappointed if they don't get to see that. But when I go through, Anthony, and you see all these national articles about spring practices and, what's the biggest question for each ranked team and all this stuff in their way too early rankings, they all center around the quarterback spot. ESPN, their number one question for Michigan going into this spring is, will Bryce Underwood be ready to start right away? Ari Wasserman from On3, our coworker, did an article doing an early prediction on all the quarterback battles across the country, the high-profile ones. He has Mikey Keene starting the opener, replaced in the season by Bryce Underwood. But, this is one of the more high-profile battles in the country. All eyes kind of on Bryce Underwood. And I agree with them. That's my number one question heading into the spring is, how do they handle this? Chip Lindsey, new offensive coordinator, has talked about how he's going to split up the reps equally at the beginning of the spring. I think it's smart. I think it eases both newcomers in, Mikey Keene and Bryce Underwood. It takes some pressure off of Bryce to just be the number one guy right away. But you got to imagine that there are going to be some pretty ridiculous flashes there at Glick and on the field outside from Bryce Underwood. And obviously you hope other guys step up along with him.
It's a familiar formula. It's a formula that we've seen them use when there's quarterback battles at Michigan in the past, where, starting out, everyone's going to be equal, and then how you perform, what you put on film, is going to determine if you get more, if you get less, where you're at in the pecking order. So that's all going to play itself out. So if you're a fan that's like, oh, they're going to split up reps, like, this is ridiculous, like Underwood is clearly the guy, why wouldn't you do this? Why wouldn't you do that? It's going to work itself out. And if it's meant to be, it will be. Now, on the flip side of that, when it comes to how we talk about this offense, when it comes to Bryce Underwood in general, and I know there's maybe a portion of the fan base or some analysts who say, let's take it easy, let's ease him on in, let's see, let him come out when the time is right. You don't make the investment at the quarterback position that Michigan did without force-feeding this guy as much as he can possibly handle. Because if you think he is the best in the country relative to his peers, he's going to be able to handle that. And it's so how do you strike that balance is going to be interesting to me. If he's ready for it, he'll earn the job. It's when practice starts, it's going to be March 18th. No jobs can be won or lost on March 18th. No jobs can be won or lost probably on April 19th. when the spring game takes place. So it's all about just spring ball is so much about the muscle memory and getting the reps and installing the offense and then building it out from there. And I think with this team at large, by virtue of, I don't know if I would call it surviving last season, but getting through some of the turbulence of last year and then finishing the year on the note that they did, there was kind of like it's no disrespect to any of those guys, but there was kind of like, hey, we're the guys that are left over after the coaching staff was picked over, after the guys on the roster made their decisions. So when you're able to survive that and have the year that they did, and now you have the opportunity to add to that with what you brought in the transfer portal, you add to that with what you brought in on the recruiting trail and the investments that you've been able to make in NIL since, all those boats are now kind of sailing the same direction. It's exciting. And I feel like the youth that's coming into this program is going to be a nice shot in the arm and a nice juxtaposition against, like you said, you're going to have two guys like Max Bredesen and Rodmore who return as captains of this team. So I opened the show by talking about the chemical mixture of what they have. I'm a fan of it right now as we sit here on March 12th.
In the offense in general is going to be another big question for me of just what it's going to look like. You're not going to put it all in the spring, but it's nice to be able to build around a quarterback like Bryce Underwood potentially if he ends up being the starter. But it sounds like Chip Lindsey, when he was talking on the In the Trenches podcast a few weeks ago, he wants everyone to have a clean slate. He doesn't want to watch too much game and practice film of each guy too closely because he wants to go in there with a fresh set of eyes. And the interesting thing is he's, other than some assistant position coaches and support staffers, he's the only new assistant coach on this team. He's the only fresh set of eyes, but he has a massive hand in what this team is going to look like next season. I think that there are a lot of questions about the offense, the offensive line. You don't have everyone here either that's going to be here for the season, but the O-line, I think, is probably the biggest question mark on the team. The most interesting thing is the quarterback battle, but the biggest concern is probably what the offensive line looks like, what the playmakers are. I mean, I think back last year to Dylan Raiola at Nebraska, then the whole, he did a fine job as a freshman starting quarterback, but then the whole thing all offseason is they got to get him some weapons. I could kind of see that maybe being the case after this year at Michigan, but they have a spring portal that they're going to go after some receivers in. So I think that they have a good chance of actually making that not be as big of a concern. I have confidence that this staff will get some things done there. So, your thoughts, I guess, just on the looming question of what the offense looks like, who plays what roles. I mean, there's a lot wide open, and I think that fall camp is really when it's going to take shape. But this is, kind of when they start to evaluate and explore different options of how they're going to run this offense.
I think having a functional quarterback, whether it is Keene or Underwood, mixed with a guy in Chip Lindsey who, I have a family member who always says, in terms of like watching baseball, like when in doubt, when a guy's struggling, whatever it is, you flip over the baseball card and you're going to have a pretty good idea of the type of player, the type of guy that's on your team. And with a guy like Chip Lindsey, who has this long sort of rap sheet of, calling some creative and explosive offense, and has worked with guys like Gus Malzahn and why is the name escaping me? Todd Monken.
Yep.
Applying principles from what you've learned from those guys, applying principles from a guy like Sherrone Moore, who's called some really good offense at Michigan, even though it's more of the meat and potatoes variety. You mix that with functional quarterback play, and I think that does mean good things for a guy. We know that Samaj Morgan can do more than catch a 2-yard bubble screen. Like, we've seen him do that at Michigan. We saw them do it as a true freshman. Frederick Moore, I think at times, has put some solid reps on film. He's going to be a guy that gets leaned on a little bit more. Donovan McCulley, I know that's a guy that no one's exactly, throwing a parade down Main Street for, but a guy that has proven Big Ten production at a school like Indiana. With the size, they were lacking that last year. So I feel like I don't know how good it's going to be, but I don't think they're going to look like the Iowa Hawkeyes when they go out there, next. And that's no disrespect intended to Iowa. They were much better offensively last year, but
I mean, disrespect them. Who cares?
Full disrespect, no disrespect, whatever. You take it how you want. That's how people do it with us anyways. But I just feel like the pedigree and having the fresh set of eyeballs on offense, having that, I mean, at the very least, I mean, I feel comfortable saying the quarterback room is stabilized. We'll see just how good Bryce Underwood can be early. But you take in, there weren't any other changes to the offensive coaching staff, but you bring in a guy like Soup Campbell to work with Ron Bellamy, who has a long pedigree of coaching the position. You bring in a guy like Juan Castillo to work with Grant Newsome on the offensive line. And, again, it's just, I don't know how good the parts are at wide receiver, on the offensive line, and to a certain extent at quarterback, but you're a little more confident that they can get those guys to play their best football. And I don't know what the best version of this offense's football is. I don't know how good the play, especially up front, especially at wide receiver, but I know it's much better than what we saw last year. And it has to be.
What's funny is before last season, everyone was saying, like, they're not going to be Iowa. Everyone relax or whatever.
No, I feel like I'm having deja vu when I say that, but
no, but then they were worse than Iowa last year. But I agree. I don't think it's going to be as bad this year. They should
say is that with what they added, I guess with what I'm trying to say is with what they've added, it can't get worse. Knock on, I don't have any wood available to me here, but knock on something. I just don't think it can be worse. I think it will only get better, and I think it will get better in a positive way that you have something to hang your hat on heading into 26 and 27.
No, I totally agree. I just find it funny when you look back at last year and we were all saying that, and then it was a disaster on offense.
Yeah.
It was basically beyond a disaster offensively. It was like you didn't have an offense for portions of games, full games. You didn't have.
We'll just call it what it was. I mean, it was pathetic. It was really tough to watch. Extremely tough to watch. Extremely frustrating.
What are you curious about with the defense? Because they do bring back more than the offense does. You have more experience there. Also, you sub more at a lot of positions on defense. So guys have played snaps, but you do lose all of your best players on that side of the ball. Wink Martindale, I thought it was interesting him talking about how much better he feels about the depth in the interior of the defensive line, which was a weakness last year. It makes you feel good. He said, I don't want to talk about the incoming transfers because I haven't seen them on the field yet, so he couldn't speak to what they're going to bring, but it seems like he's pretty pleased with at least what the roster looks like on paper. That would have been a concern for me and still really is. I think depth at edge rushers, something that I'm curious about. If the linebacker play has to improve this season, do you have enough depth on the back end at corner? Who's the nickel? Like, there's a lot back, and the returning production is there other than, your two studs, Will Johnson, who only played half of last year anyway, so you got to see some other guys in there. But there's still some big questions. I think the thing you have going for you is that Wink Martindale's back. I mean, that's massive.
I think my biggest question right now is, do you have a defensive line that can take over games and that can set a tone in games? And we've seen Derek Moore do some really good things on the field. We've seen Rayshon Benny do some really good things on the field, but you're losing two dominant defensive tackles and your best pass rusher from last year, at least from a sacks perspective. And that has a chain reaction on the rest of the defense. When those guys get home, secondary doesn't have to cover quite as long. And the linebackers, their job is to more just clean up anything that might squeeze through. Cornerback's a bit of a question. I don't know. I think there are still some growing pains that they're going through with guys like Jair Hill, Josiah Edmond. You have some nice pieces there, but I don't know. You're right. There's a drop. They're losing their best players from that side of the ball. And Well, on one hand, you want to say, "Oh, well, that Alabama game that might be predictive of what this thing looks like next year." And on the other hand, you wonder, did that Alabama team even want to be in that game? I mean, I know Jalen Milroe played to put stuff on film for the NFL, and that backfired on him. So I don't know. Like, I don't know what it's going to look like. I think it can be pretty good. I think it can be one of the 3 or 4 best defenses in the Big Ten. Heck, they could be the best defense in the Big Ten. I think they're that well coached. But personnel wise, when you bring in guys like Trey Williams and Damon Payne, who they've been rotational guys at Clemson and Alabama. That's not Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant, and that's not me hating on those guys, but it's just I do think that there's, you won that Ohio State game because you completely control the line of scrimmage with your defensive line. Do you have a unit that's able to do that this year? I think you can play some pretty darn good football. Are they going to be dominant? That's what I'm excited to see.
Mm-hmm. It's going to be interesting to see who plays where, how it comes together. I'm, again, especially curious about what the nickel spot is going to look like, considering how big it is in this defense. Is there, give me your transfer and your early enrollee freshman that you're most excited to watch or hear about this spring. I feel like the legend of Jayshon Barham last spring started to grow. You heard all about him. He maybe didn't live up to the hype as a football player, but great athlete and improved throughout the year. He was kind of the main guy that was talked about, but more transfers to choose from this time. And certainly some freshmen. I guess maybe you'll take Bryce Underwood out of it.
Yeah, I was going to say the easy answer would be to just follow the money. And so I'll start with the transfer with Marcus Haynes. I know that we're huge fans of what we saw out of Jordan Marshall in that bowl game. And, a guy that was a top 100 recruit, kind of, I don't know if he's Blake Corum, but he's kind of off that same conveyor belt from the running back factory. Excited to see what he does. But Haynes is a guy that we had even heard, before he's in the portal, that if he hops in, that's someone that might be a priority target. And they outbid for him. They're expecting him to play a major role. And I'm interested in seeing, because you throw on some of his highlights from Alabama, and he's a bowling ball and he's got the juice in the open field. So as much as we talk about how much better can this passing game be, how much better is the offensive line, the quarterbacks, the wide receivers, I think at least for next year's team, the run game is still the engine of this offense. And the investment that was made in him, they expect him to be a big part of that. So I'm excited to see what he brings. A non-Bryce Underwood freshman, early enrollee. Andrew Marsh is enrolled early, right?
Yes.
Okay, that would probably be my guy. Top 100 talent at wide receiver. I don't have the composite up in front of me, so I don't know who had him where, but when you lose a Tyler Morris type of guy, as a slot receiver from this offense, maybe a guy who can bounce out and play a little bit of Z as well. Andrew Marsh is intriguing to me. I don't know, how big of a role he might have, but in a wide receiver room where they don't really have I don't think you can even pencil in a top 2 or 3 at the moment. You could write down who you think it might be, but in a room where the reps are wide open, that's probably my pick there.
Yeah, I'm going to go with Shamari Earls as a freshman at corner. I just think he's a guy that could potentially see the field early on. I think Marsh could as well. I think there are several candidates, but corner is, you have Jair Hill. They're going to start with Zeke Berry playing at the outside spot. He's versatile. He could play elsewhere, but I want to look back at this. When was the last time you started and finished a season and every game in between was started by the same 2 outside corners? It just doesn't seem to happen, and they've been low on depth there. That was a huge land, I thought, when they got him towards the end of the recruiting cycle. So I'm going to go with him, but there are some others who I think could impact. I just want to hear too from some of the offensive linemen how Andrew Babalola is fitting in. Maybe not start right away, but is he different than maybe some of these other freshmen? Because freshman offensive linemen don't usually get talked about that much because they understand there's a lot to learn. There's the technique, there's the playbook, There's all sorts of things. There's just the weight room too. I mean, a lot of these guys don't come in physically, the way that they need to impact. He is certainly going to need to add some size. But that'll be kind of interesting to just hear how their teammates talk about him in the coaching staff and get kind of a read on where he's at in the depth chart. And then my transfer, I'm maybe excited to watch other guys, but I'm maybe most curious about Donovan McCulley at wide receiver. Like how good is he? How much juice does he add to a receiver room that needs some badly? Just talent, size, catching ability, all of it, and how good he could be right away for them. I'm going to tread lightly, I guess, on making big conclusions on like what's said about receivers, because we heard a lot about that group last year and they didn't perform all that well. They didn't have great quarterback play either, but he could be, he could be an important one there. And I think they'll add, like we said earlier, at the receiver spot. But anything else?
It's not a negative. It's not a
Yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted you there, but it's not a negative to say this, but I feel like I'm covering this spring ball fall camp with a little more skepticism than whereas last year it was like you're riding off the vibes of a national title. There's all this newness, but there's this excitement for a new era. There was a lot of optimism there. That's not to say I'm doubting what's said or what will be said coming out of the building, but I do think there'll be a little more guarded skepticism in terms of the tone by which we cover this team until we see them play.